Welcome to Trifecta Collective, Finding the Root, where we dive deep into understanding and addressing root causes of chronic health issues so you can help and find healing inside and out, now and forever. Collective, Finding the Root. I'm Megan Abbott, owner and founder of the holistic health practice Trifecta Collective. Welcome to the podcast. So today I want to talk about grief. And there's many forms of grief that many of us, potentially even most of us, experience when we're going through our own healing journeys. And this can really kind of come in waves and in phases, and this can look really different for people. And so I want to touch on probably all of these today, and then potentially do some other episodes where I dive a little bit deeper into how I've worked and how I've helped clients work through some of these different types of grief. But I think it's important to acknowledge this, and I am going to talk about grief as it relates to losing someone or losing people as well today in multiple capacities. So before I really dive in, invitation here to recognize where you are emotionally at this moment, and is this the best time to listen to this podcast? And it may bring up, if you've lost people in your life, once again, this doesn't mean just they're no longer physically here on this planet. It's going to mean a variety of different things. And just to make sure you're in a good enough place to be able to listen to this, because it may bring up some stuff. It obviously may not. And if you have lost a lot of people, if you are actively grieving, this might make you help feel less alone, or it can bring up a lot. So I would encourage you to really make sure you're in a good spot to be able to listen to this. So, the first, I guess, more obvious kind of grief that most of us will experience, so arguably all of us will experience at some point in our lives, is the loss of a loved one. And really, when I was coming up with this idea about grief, it stemmed from, in the last couple of weeks, the 5-year anniversary of my mother's passing happened, and brought up a lot of feelings, a lot of grief, a lot of sadness, and many other complicated emotions that I continue to feel that I did feel, especially right after she passed. It was very complicated. And I will get into a little bit of that, because I think it's important to share a little bit about my story, because I know a lot of people will relate to this. And, I think a big thing, and this is something I have to remind myself every year, there's 2 periods of time in every single year that it always brings up a lot of emotions for me. And grief is a big piece of that. There's a week in March where it's my mother's birthday. It's also the anniversary of my uncle's passing. And those happened a day apart, technically. So, there were several years apart, and they were also just a couple days apart. And then the other is in later June when it's the anniversary of my mother's passing, which also this year in particular brought up a lot of other emotions, because it was the 1-year anniversary of me leaving my life in Virginia. My partner and I celebrated our 1-year anniversary. We also got engaged at that time too. And so there was so much excitement and so many things going on. And it was also 5-year anniversary of my mother's passing. And my partner is still actually going through cancer treatment. So, there's a lot of emotions kind of happening here. And, sometimes I think this year I definitely did not forget. Sometimes I will forget until just a few days beforehand, but my body always remembers. And I start to feel just a little off, like maybe my sleep is a little bit weird, and maybe I have some aches and pains show up. Definitely some moodiness will often show up. I'll just be a little shorter fused, we can say, frustration, annoyance, just kind of cranky. And all of these things come up almost every year around these two periods of time. And it's really an acknowledgement that my body's remembering what happened around these times. And if I'm not taking the time and space to really process these feelings and emotions that are coming up, once again, largely grief is a big one that is thrown in there. All of those symptoms are exacerbated. And so if you have anniversaries of passings of big life events, recognize that even if you don't consciously remember, even if you consciously don't feel like it's that big of a deal, your body can remember. And that can bring up a variety of physical symptoms, of emotions coming up, can just kind of, I don't want to say throw your body off, but your body's really trying to process these things. And so that can just bring up a lot and can shift things temporarily. So being aware of that and recognizing that can go a really long way as far as shifting out of that, because usually what happens is the more you can feel into those feelings, really acknowledge them, recognize them, allow them to be processed how they would like to be processed. And maybe that's crying, maybe that's anger, maybe it's talking it out, maybe it's working out, maybe it's moving, maybe it's screaming into a pillow, any or all of the above, maybe it's shaking, dancing, singing, whatever it may be. It's important that we recognize that these things can come up for us subconsciously and be able to recognize that and be aware of it so that we can help these emotions move and process how they would need to. Okay, so diving deeper into grief of losing a loved one. And this might be a friend. This is certainly, like, I think most of us are going to outlive our parents. And so most people are going to experience that kind of grief. And I do think that's a little bit of a different kind of grief. I've worked with a lot of people who have lost parents pretty young. I lost my mom when I was 30, which I would consider pretty young. She was only 60 at the time. And there was a lot of, once again, I'm going to get into it. I would say at a pretty young age, and she was, she had a lot of health complications and stuff, but some other people, their parents are pretty healthy. My uncle passed very suddenly, and he had made some not the best choices health-wise for many years, and had recently made a lot of changes. And then he suddenly passed via a heart attack. So, all of this stuff can happen, and we never know what's going to happen. And we can set ourselves up to be very prepared as much as we can be, to be able to process all of these things, because for many people, it's going to be a shocker. For others, it can be really long and drawn out, which brings about its own challenges. We lose other family members, friends, significant others, ideally not a child. I can't even imagine. And obviously that does happen. So, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to grieve. And once again, I have gone through this twice now in the last 5 years. And I've also supported many people in their grieving journeys, whether that is pretty shortly after or many years after. And sometimes it does not matter. And sometimes those emotions can feel the exact same. And so I think it's important to acknowledge this. So, just to share a little bit about me and my story, with my mom and her passing, just to give a little context, just in case you don't know my story, or maybe you haven't heard this part of my story, or haven't heard it in a while. But, I had a very complicated relationship with my mother. She raised me, only child. She was a single parent. And she was an alcoholic for the vast majority of my life. I remember 7 is when I started to put the pieces together that she had a problem. And she was also a high functioning alcoholic. So most people in her life and in our life did not know for many, many, many years. Arguably, some of them still don't recognize it, even though that played a big piece in her passing. And, So I was 30 when she passed. We had a lot of significant issues and went through very long periods of not speaking or not speaking very much for a good portion of my adult life. My last year of college, even the summer beforehand kind of started that. Right after college, it was a little bit better for a couple years. And then it really took a turn kind of right around when I was like 23, 24 is when things started to really shift again. And I started to put up a lot of boundaries myself that she was not a fan of. And the biggest of those was if she had been drinking, and because I grew up with her, if you've grown up with an alcoholic, you can tell the moment they've had a drink. It's also never just one drink. It's a bottle of something. It's a couple bottles of something. It's a case of something. So, that was a really big boundary. And she was alcoholic. So she was drunk most of the time, which means I would not speak to her most of the time. There was a lot of phone calls of, hey, I can tell you've been drinking. I'm about to hang up. There was a lot of, no, I am not coming to see you anymore because I need this space. I need some time to be able to work on my own healing journey. And then there was two kind of events that really led to us not communicating for the last several years that she was alive. And coincidentally, they were both weddings. The first one was she made a really big scene. She was drinking. She made a really big scene. I had come up. I had driven to go to this wedding. And I was really there to support my uncle. I went back and forth quite a bit about going and not going. I honestly did not want to go because I knew she would be there and she was bringing her significant other of the time, which did not help anything. And she did cause a scene. I ended up leaving that night. I was there for maybe 3 hours in total. And, I couldn't do it. And so I left, within a few hours of just getting there. And I spent some time there to support my uncle, who was arguably the person in my family who I was closest with. And I left. And that really started to put some big space between our relationship because that's exactly what I was expecting. And when that really solidified for me, I put up stronger and stronger boundaries. A couple years after that, once again, another wedding. And I was like, look, if you are drinking, I will absolutely not speak to you. And I really put some very strong ground rules in there. And I said, I don't know if I'm open to seeing you at all outside of the actual wedding itself. I'm going to have to play it by ear and see how I feel, see how things go. And really for me, it was a test of if she can show up to this wedding and be a sober individual, then I might consider, having dinner with her or doing something with her while I was up there with her. That was not the case. While she did not drink, she was on what I'm assuming is a variety of painkillers, and that she was on a variety of medications for most of her life, and she had turned, I believe, to painkillers at some point, and it was largely because she knew that if she was drinking, there was going to be some pretty significant consequences with that came with that, and so she came very drugged up on pills. And that was really my last straw. And so that was in 2017. And 3 years later, she passed, pretty much almost exactly 3 years later, she passed. And during that time, she really struggled. She was admitted to the hospital on many occasions. And I would speak with her doctors and nurses, more so than her. She ended up having 2 liver transplants. Her first one got rejected. Arguably, was she drinking? I don't totally know. And I do know it's a high possibility that even though she got a liver transplant and then 2, that also brought up a series of very complicated emotions for me. She had tried to go to rehab a couple times during that time. And she was a significant mess, during that time. And she changed a lot. And even when I saw her, at the very end, physically she looked really different. And that, once again, that brought up its own, grief and challenges. And once again, that was the parent that I had growing up. Like, she is the person who raised me. I do have a relationship with my father as now as an adult. He was not a part of my life as a child or growing up. He also had no awareness that that was going on. Once again, she was pretty darn good. Most of the rest of my family had no idea, and or had no idea of the real significance, and we'll say maybe the extreme nature that this disease took on her. And so going into this, one, like setting those boundaries. I mean, anytime you have to put that kind of space between a parent and or really any other family members, like that can be really tough. I did spend many holidays alone. I spent Christmas all by myself, and I'll tell you that was the worst one. A lot of grief, a lot of sadness, Thanksgivings and a variety of things. And it was really tough. And before she passed, like 3 or 4, probably 4 months before she passed, I had really, really started to take a deep dive into my own like trauma healing, nervous system regulation journey. And I was introduced to energy healing at that time and was working with Christina Rice, or Christina the Channel. And I am so grateful for that timing, because the work that we did leading up to it, well, I mean, her death was a surprise to me. I'll just talk a little bit about the series of events without getting into too much detail. But, I'm so grateful that I started that journey ahead of time, because as hard as that was, I think it could have been way harder and way worse. And I would say it took me about 1.5 years to process that kind of grief for me. And I would say process meaning the big feelings, meaning like I don't know if you can tell, but for me right now, I can tell my voice is getting a little shaky. There are emotions coming up. So it's not like I don't get emotional talking about these things or remembering them or thinking about them. And I'm able to do that without completely breaking down. And for me, that's a real sign that I've done a lot of my own processing when it comes to the grief work, which is where I think is very healthy. Where, of course, anytime we talk about someone passing, we can miss people. It can bring up a lot of emotions. Of course it can. And I think recognizing that, but not being so overconsumed by that emotion, I do think that goes a really long way. And so, I was doing all this prep work, and then I got a call all of a sudden. She was in the hospital. This was on a Thursday. My uncle called me back in the hospital. That, not a surprise to me. She was in the hospital pretty regularly the last like probably 5 years of her life, as she was getting worse and worse. Even before the transplants, they told her years beforehand, hey, you have cirrhosis of the liver. If you don't stop drinking, it's going to get worse, and you're going to go into liver failure, which is exactly what happened. But I got a call on Thursday saying, hey, she's back in the hospital. Nothing crazy. Saturday, I got a call being like, she bumped her head. She had fallen. She bumped her head. Things are a little iffy. Sunday, I got the call. Hey, you have to get up here now. She is not going to make it if you do not come now. And she was already on a ventilator. And so I was the one, and I am very grateful for my uncle for waiting for me to get there to pull the plug, which is obviously a lot. If you've ever watched someone die, I mean, it's a whole other thing. And for me still, and I was still like, yes, I had started my own healing journey, and I was still very in my own trauma still. And so, I was very trying to avoid different things. And so she passed on a Tuesday. And I stayed until Wednesday. I only stayed one night. And that was to help her, like, obviously pull the plug. And then I spent some time with my cousins, and they helped me clean out, bits and pieces of our apartment, which was a total wreck, and grab some things that I wanted to grab. And then I drove back down to Virginia, which was a lot in and of itself. And there's a lot of other things that kind of happen in that 36-hour period that I won't share, because they do involve someone else, and I'm going to be respectful of them. However, it was a lot. And I mean, driving up, I was a total wreck. Coming back down was a little bit better. I think it was more shock than anything else. And then I spent the next several days just like not knowing what to do with myself and really like in the thick of it. And it was very challenging. And invitation, if and when you do lose someone in your life, like if you can give yourself some space and some time without maybe all of your responsibilities or as many as you can kind of put to the side momentarily, I do think that goes a long way. I'll say if you're supporting someone who's grieving, one of the best things that felt very supportive of me was food. I had a couple people like give me DoorDash gift cards or, bring me food and things like that. And that was extremely helpful because one of the last things I wanted to do was cook for a couple weeks, kind of following that. Um, I think a lot of us have our own different kind of trauma responses that kind of kick into play. For me, it was avoidance, and numbness. And I just like didn't really know what to do with it. It was just like a lot. It was coming in waves. And that is totally normal. And once again, like I think the more we can give ourselves some space and some time to feel into those emotions, to be able to process them, the better. And maybe that looks like time by yourself. Maybe that looks like time with other loved ones or friends, just someone. The other thing I'll say, and people may have different opinions about this, but now this has happened to me several occasions. But anytime I've, like lost someone or kind of started to go through something big, people always want to send me books. And while some people may find that valuable, I had some people who were not close to me, who were maybe close to her when she passed, send me some books. And I was not a fan of them. Most of them were quite religious in nature and just like totally not my vibe. Like I was going through my own process and, it was very nice to hear from people and for people to reach out. And at the same time, I really didn't want people to tell me how to grieve, and be like, you need to do this, or I'm so sorry. This is such a tragedy and da, da, da. And it was very hard for me to explain to people that while I was extremely sad and definitely grieving, there were some other emotions that were coming up as well. And, relief was one of them. A sense of freedom was another one. And I think if you've grown up with a very trauma-filled parent, it is normal to feel all of these emotions and can also bring up another wave of guilt for feeling those emotions. And once again, like I know this isn't just my story because I've worked with so many clients at this point who have also felt this way. And I will also tell you that my life opened up quite a bit. And the timing of this was also a little odd. This was in the middle of COVID. And so there were some restrictions within the hospital. We were able to manipulate some things, so that I could go see her and I didn't have to be alone, when I went to go see her. And I was about to get married for the first time. I was like, let's see, that was the end of June. I was getting married beginning of September, so like 2.5 months before I was getting married. We also closed on our first house, like a week and a half later. I also had just started this business, just a few months earlier and had picked up a handful of new clients right after she passed. I was also running another business for someone else. And so there was a lot of things that were changing and shifting for me very quickly at that time, which was also very, we'll say, confusing for me because there were some really good things coming into my life. Once again, like it really did feel like a relief and a sense of freedom. Like there was a cord, if you're familiar with energy work, felt like there was a cord that I've been trying to cut or release for so long that it wouldn't. And then all of a sudden it just like let go. And I felt the difference. And once again, like it doesn't discourage from how the grief that I was feeling, the sadness that I was feeling. And at the same time, and understand that it's okay. And I think a lot of people who see someone struggling towards the end, whether that's like chronic illness issues, dementia, Alzheimer's physically going away, I also think there can be a sense of relief that comes along with that, because their suffering is no, they're not suffering anymore. And that can bring about a sense of relief, which once again, that can bring up a whole other wave of different types of emotions, the fact that you do feel that way. So if and when you do lose someone, understand that it's okay. If it's not just grief, if it's not just sadness that comes about, it's going to hit you in waves, and some of the waves might be relatively surprising. I know my first Mother's Day, man, did it hit me so hard. I was just crying, and it was, I mean, I like couldn't, I had to be around other people, and I like couldn't stand more than about 45 minutes of that. And it was so much and so overwhelming. And I was not expecting that. Holidays, my first like Thanksgiving in particular, because that was like my holiday. And that was my mom's also favorite holiday. She was also a super good cook. So she cooked Thanksgiving food a lot. Having her gone for that was challenging, and definitely brought up waves of emotions with that. And so understand that, yeah, these things can kind of hit you out of nowhere, and that's okay. And once again, the two biggest things that I can just recommend to you is, one, like, give yourself as much space as possible. And then number two, like, try and ride the waves. If you feel the grief, like, let it come out, because otherwise it's going to get stuck. And if we think about grief and sadness, and if we think about, like Chinese medicine and the energetic bodies, we think about the lungs in particular. Really hold on to grief and sadness. And I know I personally experienced actual physical health issues, like breathing issues, as a result of the grief that has been coming up, and me not letting it come up. And so that is a real thing that can happen. I've experienced it on many occasions at this point, where I start to exhibit physical symptoms if I'm not letting myself like really feel into my feelings. And sometimes I need help with that. Sometimes I need my partner, or sometimes I need, like a friend, or like one of my coaches or mentors. And that might look different depending on where I am or what's coming up for me, like where I'm feeling it. Is that like, psychedelics have played a really big role for me in that too, and being able to help me feel and process and allow things to be released. And so is energy healing, so has talk therapy, so has somatic work. I mean, there's so many tools and resources, and it's about, I think, there's so much value in trying all of them, or many of them, and seeing what resonates for you, so that when you do feel things coming up, you have different tools that you can just kind of pull out, and whatever tool feels the best for you. So that's a big thing. I think the other big thing I want to just talk about a little bit more is closure and or meaning. And once again, I don't think there's any one way to do this. And I've done this a few different ways for myself and with clients that I've worked with. Some sort of memorial, funeral service, private, personal ceremony, something is super important and super valuable. We did not have any sort of memorial, funeral, or anything for my mother, largely because it was COVID. Also because she had alienated most of the people in her life at that point in time. And there was a lot going on, and so surrounding that. So we didn't do that. We cremated her, which is what she wanted. She wanted to be spread in the ocean, which I did on my honeymoon, which was not the best time and place to do that. I got her ashes at my wedding, and then spread the ashes at the funeral. This time around is going to be totally different, which I'm also super excited about. Yeah, giving yourself the space and time for that closure, really, really valuable. Once again, I don't think that has to do anything particular. I did do like a little ceremony when I spread her ashes in the ocean, which I did think was helpful. And the other thing I did, and this took me a few months to do, was I wrote my own eulogy. I wrote a letter of what I would have said, or what I would have wanted to say had she had a funeral or a service. And it was just for me. I didn't do anything with it, except just write it for myself. And letter writing a eulogy, voice recording something. What would you want to say to them? What would you want to say about them? that can go a really long way. I've written a lot of letters to my mom, never given them to her. And I burned many of them because it's been for me. It was not for her. It was for me. And then once again, it was just a lot of processing emotions and mixed emotions, a variety of emotions coming up here. So if you also feel this way at any point, one, know that you're not alone. Two, it's okay. Whatever you are feeling is okay. There is no right or wrong way to feel. And when my uncle passed, just under less than 2 years after that, there was a different type of grieving for me. He was not the person who raised me, and we were not super close when I was growing up, and that changed in my very early 20s, right around when I was 20. That really started to shift and change for me, and he went through his own struggles and had his own issues, and after my mom passed, he really started making some changes, and we really resonated in where we were in our healing journey, in our own healing journey, and how that looked being surrounded by people who maybe weren't on their own healing journey, and what that really looked like. And that was a very special time for me to be able to connect with him in that way. And when big things happen in my life, big healing things happen in my life, like I still really think about him. If you can't tell, got some emotion going up, which is totally fine. And so, that's just how it works. And for his passing, there was a memorial, there was a service. We actually went to two, which I did think that really was helpful. So if that is an option for you, once again, it doesn't have to be like a whole big thing, but even doing some sort of private ceremony can go a super, super long way. And once again, I've written letters to him. I've written letters of what I would want to say about him. I did not speak at his funeral. But that was really important and really valuable for me. I think the other piece of this is, I know there's the book, now I'm going to forget the name of the book. It's like the 5 steps to grief or 5 steps to 4 steps, something like that, something around grief. If you just do a basic Google search, it'll 100% pop up. But then this author did a sequel later on that talked about coming up with a meaning to death. And I think that can be really challenging for some people. I also don't think that needs to happen for everyone. And for me personally, I have actually found a lot of value in that. With these individuals dying, and no longer physically being with us in this physical world, I am also fortunate that with their passing, and I don't super resonate with either one of these words, but psychic or mediumship abilities, they got stronger. And so, that has been an option for me, which I know is not the case for everyone. And I'm very fortunate about that. And that has been a very nice way to connect with both of them. And as far as meaning, and once again, that has also helped me with meaning. And a big piece, especially with my mom, was allowing both of us to do our own deeper healing work. Would I be where I am if she was here as far as my own healing journey? I don't know. I don't know if I would be. And so I am very grateful for that and to be able to have that experience, and to also know that she has also had that experience too. And so I think that can go a really long way. And once again, I don't think there has to be meaning. And I think for many people that can be super, super valuable to find meaning if it happens to come. I wouldn't actively go searching for it. But several years, about a year and a half after she passed, is when I really started to feel that way of wow, look at the amount of healing work that I've really done and been able to do. And I am not totally sure that would have been possible if she was here. And so I am, once again, very grateful for that. So yeah, that's kind of grief of losing a loved one. And once again, just it can hit you out of the blue. I was totally good before going to this podcast, and I did not think I was going to cry. And that is also okay, for these emotions to come up and to be processed, once it's just like being processed. So that's obviously a big piece of grief. And the other types of grief, and I'm going to do a part 2 now, for this, but I want to touch on a couple of these here in the next few minutes. But throughout our healing journey, we can really experience a lot of different types of grief, for a variety of things. I think I'll mention a few of the big ones, and then in a part 2, I'll kind of dive deeper into these and what this can really look like. But, I think for a lot of us, when we start to deal with a lot of health issues, or start to become very aware of our trauma patterns, or the level of trauma we've experienced, or how dysregulated our nervous system is, that can be really tough. And, we can really grieve our old life of like what you were able to do, what you were able to accomplish, especially if you were kind of like me, like a type A kind of person who was like, I like prided myself on my work ethic and all of these things. And then to be totally taken out by chronic illness issues and need to sleep like, I don't know, 10 to 15 hours a day and still be tired and not be able to work the amount that I was used to or accustomed to. And I would be very frustrated. And there was a lot of annoyance and a lot of things coming up for me around that. And it's like a grief of what life you used to have and how you can want that still for yourself. And understanding, long-term chronic illness issues, while I'm like totally healed is not quite right, but I'm in a very good position where I've done a lot of healing work physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and I'm in a very good spot. And so, and recognizing that by and large, and, sometimes grieving the life like that maybe I did want at some point. And like, what did that look like? And is that really a possibility now? And it's not necessarily what I want now. And that doesn't mean that because it was a big part of my life for a period of time, doesn't mean I think about that. And so I think it's important to understand that. And maybe you do have some longer term limitations and recognizing that, I think, and sometimes I think this is I'm getting older and I can no longer, go out and drink until midnight and like wake up at 6 a.m. and go to work and like still be okay. And that's super sad. Or, go run a marathon and like totally be okay and all that kind of stuff. And being like, well, maybe our bodies are not like that anymore. Or maybe we can't handle that anymore. Maybe it probably wasn't the best for us in the first place. And that can bring up like waves of grief of, not having the same capacity, quote unquote capacity, as we once had. And that can be sad. I think a really big one is outgrowing people in your life, in your healing journey. And this is a really big one. And I think there's a few different directions that this can go. It's like, for me, I lost most of my friends when I stopped drinking very much. And, most of my social activities were revolved around drinking and going out and things like that. And I don't do that anymore. That is not of interest to me. And recognizing that those friendships needed to fade away, and it can take a lot of time to find new ones and find ones that feel good, find relationships that feel very deep, where you do feel very connected, where you can feel like you can be yourself. And I think a piece of this, and I just had a conversation with a client about this, is finding people who also understand maybe your trauma. And it can feel very lonely, very isolating. There can be a lot of grieving around never feeling understood or really feeling seen and heard. And I'll tell you, I have several friends who grew up with very similar backgrounds, different and similar, alcoholic parent, a lot of mental and emotional struggles growing up, once again, maybe not the exact same. And it's kind of comforting to have those relationships. And it's not about dwelling on the past or, being able to, co-regulate in a very negative way. It's really about feeling really understood. growing up with an alcoholic parent, I mean, it's a very specific experience that most people don't get to experience, thank goodness. And for those of us who did, yeah, it's a lot. It really is. And there, once again, like, when your parent dies and they've been an alcoholic your whole life, the complicated emotions and people not understanding that, wow, yes, you were very sad and there's a lot of grief coming up. And there can be a whole bunch of other emotions also coming up. And so having those relationships, like, where do we find those? How does that really look like it really work? Having to take time and space away from family, setting up these really strong boundaries, having to be by yourself, and these feelings of loneliness and grieving, having really close family and friends, and maybe you've had to, unfortunately, set some really strong boundaries with many people in your life, potentially everyone in your life. And what does that really look like? And that can bring up a whole lot of grieving too. And so recognizing all of this, that there's a lot of grieving that can happen throughout our healing journey, and grief isn't specific to just physically losing someone in our lives. And this can come about with a lot of different types of experiences. And it's a very, very common when it comes to healing journeys. And know that you are not alone. There's nothing wrong with you if you are experiencing a lot of these feelings. And really, the biggest thing I can encourage you to do is, one, reach out to people who you do trust. And if you don't really have anyone, reach out to us. I've been through a whole bunch. The rest of our team has been through a whole bunch. And even if it's not exactly the same, I bet we can relate in some different ways, and know that you're not alone. Giving yourself yourself the space to feel those feelings, also super, super important. So, and I know it can feel very hard. I know it can feel very overwhelming. And once again, in part 2, I want to dive deeper into all of those things and some more specifics of what and how they can look, and some suggestions, and some additional thoughts as to what this can kind of look like and feel like. Because once again, I've been there, and I've worked with so many people, so many women who have also experienced this. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there and kind of leave it at that. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to and having some of my own emotions come up. And once again, that if you had a lot of emotions come up during this episode, you are not alone. Invitation to continue to feel and process all of those emotions. As always, please like, subscribe, follow if it resonates. 5-star reviews really, really, really mean the world to us. And thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.